And some of the most cruel things I saw committed against animals or committed against people were done basically in farms that were farming plant foods, right? So what I'm proposing, and I've written an essay about this several years ago, what I'm proposing is that actually the way to see ethics is not in animal versus plant foods, it is in industrial versus agroecology. Is veganism more ethical? That is the question I would like to get into today. And I feel, I feel that I kind of don't want to discuss this because really this channel is more about healing after veganism, healing especially autoimmune disease, healing different things. My own experience of being a vegan and so on for several years, and then transitioning out of it into an ancestrally appropriate diet. So that's really what this channel is about. But I keep getting questions. I keep getting asked, "What do you think about vegan ethics? What do you think about vegan ethics?" Sometimes by vegans, mostly by vegans, to be perfectly honest, but sometimes not. Sometimes by people who are clearly not vegan, but have imbibed the sort of vegan ideology. Okay, so let's get into it. So what is the argument? The argument is something like this, right? So it's usually very um, personal. It's very like, could you look this animal in the eye and kill it and this kind of stuff. It's trying to appeal to animals' cuteness to make a point. And if you try and actually have a debate with a vegan, and I've done this many times, you'll find that they can't stick to one topic. You'll find that you're discussing whatever it may be, animal cruelty and living standards and ecosystems, and then they'll pivot to climate change or something like that, right? So I think the first thing to say is that, and this is someone who is I was, I wasn't a small time vegan. I was like the vice president of the vegan society in my university at a certain point in time. The first thing to say is that there's a lot of inconsistencies when we talk about vegan ethics, but the basic principle is that, basically, if you can eat without harming animals, you're doing better than if you could eat, eating normally by harming animals. But that sort of begs the question. It begs a number of questions. Um, can you actually eat without harming animals? And what I would tell you is, no, you can't. And in fact, and I'm saying this not just as someone with a degree in moral philosophy and someone who's spent a long time as a vegan and sort of dive very deep into vegan ethics. I'm also saying this as someone who has worked with small farmers around the world for a number of years. I had a job working in Asia mostly, so Thailand, Vietnam, to some extent Laos, not as much as I would have liked. India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal. I know these countries. I know the farming systems very well. And what I learned from, when I first joined that world, I was very much a vegetarian. I was very much a vegan. Though I didn't last long as a vegan because it just wasn't practical, wasn't possible to source vegan food. So having conversations with them, it became very clear. And then looking at what was going on in front of my eyes, it became very clear that veganism, the plot problem was not animals versus plants, right? And some of the most cruel things I saw committed against animals or committed against people were done basically in farms that were farming plant foods, right? So what I'm proposing, and I've written an essay about this several years ago, what I'm proposing is that actually the way to see ethics is not in animal versus plant foods, it is in industrial versus agroecology. Okay, so keep those terms in mind. We'll define them in just a second. Okay, now most vegans, I would say 99.99% of vegans out there, are living in urban environments, right, or semi-urban, suburban environments, and they are sourcing their food from a grocery store. And if you are sourcing especially vegan food from a grocery store, you are committing what I would describe as ecocide. What do I mean by that? I mean, you are probably eating, in fact, I can almost guarantee you're eating some kind of quote unquote staple crop. So wheat, rice, some combination of grains, right? That's forming a pretty significant part of your diet. And then vegetables, including tubers, nightshades, et cetera, et cetera. Now, all of these things, when they are commercially grown, in fact, even when they're not commercially grown, even when they're organically grown and so on, they involve tilling the soil. They involve using a shovel, using a tool to really loosen up that soil and plant the seeds and so on. Now, whenever you do that, you're doing a number of things. They also involve, we're not getting into pesticides or fertilizers yet. We'll get into that in a second. But when you break up the soil, you are destroying the habitat. You are destroying the wildlife. You're destroying all the animals that exist below the ground, some of which you can't see, some of which you can see. And if you go online and you look for whatever it is, crops or crops being at the end of the season when you have a big tractor that's going through and sort of mowing down the maize, mowing down the corn, you will see that there are birds, not just birds looking for any kind of plant matter that may be left after that. The birds that are scavenger birds, carnivorous birds are going afterwards, and they're eating all the whatever it is, rabbits, moles, all kinds of rodents, but also smaller things, lizards and so on, that have been chopped up by the machines. And you can do some maths, you can do some estimations, and what you will find is that these industrial farming practices are extremely, extremely costly when it comes to animal life. And from my point of view, again, going back to that difference between industrial farming and agroecology, from my point of view, whenever you have that industrial farming, it's always going to lead to not just ecocide, which is the destruction of entire ecosystems. It's going to lead to a lot of waste. Okay, what do I mean by that? The industrial system sees things linearly. Okay, so I have a patch of land. I need to put inputs on it. So the inputs are seeds, fertilizers, maybe pesticides, but at least seeds and fertilizers. And then it would give me outputs. The outputs are my food crops and waste. Okay. Now, the difference between that and agroecology is circular. Okay. I have a patch of land. It already has a number of things in it. Maybe I can add some more seeds at certain points in time and get them without tilling, without really destroying the environment at all. I can add seeds that will thrive naturally in that environment. Ideally, seeds that are plants that are indigenous to that environment. Why? Because when the plant gets preyed upon, and plants will get preyed upon by herbivorous insects, if it's an indigenous plant to that environment, it already knows the insects that are around there and it can defend itself from those insects. And by the way, those insects will then attract predators, right? So you have spiders and other things. In fact, my first job in some of this work was using something called integrated pest management. Basically, our tool was spiders. We would go and introduce indigenous spiders to fields that were, being destroyed by pests, and the farmers didn't want to use pesticides, and we would use farmers as a way to sort of create ecosystems or mimic ecosystems. So I've learned a lot of this just from actual practice. Okay, and that was again back in the day when I was still very much pro vegan. I can't remember if I was still vegan or if I'd transitioned to lacto over at that time, but my ideology was still very much pro vegan at that point in time. Okay. Okay, so we have the definitions, we have industrial agriculture, we have agroecology. Now, if you're sort of looking at the ethics of the plate, which is where a lot of this comes to, when you look at the ethics of the plate, you'll find that there are foods, even in industrial systems, that have to be grown in line with the principles of agroecology. And particularly, we're talking here about ruminant meat, okay? Because things like lamb, for example, sheep, you have to feed sheep, grass. They're not really going to do well on anything else. That's the same for cows, with one exception or with a couple of exceptions. So cows can be fed, dairy cows, for example, can be fed a relatively small percentage of their feed can come from non-grass, non-hay sources. I'll talk about why grazing is so important and why grass is so important in a second, but just to sort of counter this argument first, you can only feed dairy cows a very small amount of non-grass feed, number one. So most of their feed is coming from grass and hay. Number two, for cows that are raised for meat, or oxes, bulls that are raised for meat, they can also be fed a small amount of grains, and usually that'll be at the end of their life to fatten them up. Okay, the fact that we feed cows grains to fatten them up should tell you something about grains. Okay. Now, all that aside, why am I emphasizing cows and ruminants so much? Because ruminants are a key part of these ecosystems. When we look at the places where we live, I live here in Southern Africa, massive grasslands. We're here in the savannah. This is where, in fact, not far from here is where humans evolved. So this is the ecosystem within which humans evolved to prey on those species that were on the grasslands. So the grass is important because the grass is one of those plants that actually grows more underneath than it grows above. And when it's going underneath, it's doing lots of things. It's capturing carbon. If you care about carbon capture, it's capturing lots of important sort of elements from the air into the soil, deep into the soil, and it's making the soil very rich and fertile. Now, if you don't have this approach to growing grass, you need to put fertilizer, and most of that fertilizer is coming either from animals, in which case, are you a vegan if you're using whatever it is, animal feed to grow your food, or it's coming from fossil fuels. And I would, given those two choices, I mean, I know what I would choose, but if you want to be eating petroleum products, that's totally your business. Most of us, if you do a test, most of us probably have or do have petroleum project products in us. Most of us who've eaten anything like industrial foods for any period of time, I guarantee you take a blood test, you will find some petroleum product residue, just because that's in the fertilizer of the foods we've been eating, right? Okay, so we have a choice. Either we let those grasslands grow. Now, in order for the grasslands to grow, they need ruminants, because what will happen if the ruminants don't come is the grass overgrows. So ruminants only eat the top of the plant. They don't uproot it. The roots stay. permanent. They stay there. They stay settled. The ruminants eat the top of the plant and they encourage the bottom of the plant to grow. This is what the grasslands need. So without a healthy herd, your grasslands will not be healthy. And by the way, in order to have a healthy herd, you also need a healthy predator population. This is what I mean when we talk about ecosystems. They're quite complicated, and I'm only talking about three sets of animals in this ecosystem. Actually, there's many more. We have to talk about insects. We have to talk about birds. We have to talk about all these things, right? So maybe we'll get to birds in a second if we introduce chickens into this system. So in other words, you can have a system where you're growing, say, soy, which is destroying everything underneath, and you're using these artificial inputs to actually grow it. You probably need things like pesticides. You might need, Roundup Ready, like these insane glyphosate weed killer products, et cetera, right? You might need all that, or you can grow. You could even grow soy in some places if it's an indigenous crop, but grow it as cover feed. And in which case, maybe at a certain point you will harvest the soybeans or some of the soybeans, and you will let the cows in to eat the rest of it, eat the rest of the soy plant, et cetera, right? I'll just give you an example here, and if we want the details of how sustainable farming, regenerative farming, agroecology works, that's a whole different course. Like there are other people who offer those courses. I've actually looked at them, and I've studied them. I've written I helped to write a book on this some years ago. So I'm familiar with all that stuff, but we don't need to get into the technical aspect because I don't think I doubt most people watching this channel or watching this video are actual farmers. But if people are interested in learning more about the farming, let me know. I can make a follow up. Okay, so agroecology, industrial farming. Now, in the so let's go back to sort of vegan ethics. Uh, if we take the vegan word out of it, what are ethics, right? So ethics, when we do a degree in moral philosophy, we learn basically about two systems. Now, I think the important thing to learn about these systems is that there's nothing really behind them. These are based on what we call moral intuition. And so we have things like the trolley problem or other similar thought experiments. From that, we can begin to derive our intuitions. That's really what moral philosophy is about. What do humans perceive as right and wrong? There's no objective right and wrong, right? And I think we can all agree with that. Humans actually have a pretty diverse, but diverse in a limited spectrum view of what's right and wrong. And these two principles that I'm about to introduce, they take care of a big part of it. Maybe not 100% of it, but a big part of moral philosophy breaks down to two principles. One is utilitarianism. So, in other words, I should always act in such a way so as to maximize good or pleasure, or the different ways to visualize, to sort of conceive this. But in anything I do, in any action I take that may be good and bad, I should try and make sure that there's more good than bad, basically. Okay. Um, and then the second piece, this is a piece that's introduced by Kant, the categorical imperative or deontology. These are some of the terms that are used. Basically, it's I should always do unto others. I should always treat another human being as if he or she were an end in itself, an end in his or herself, and never as a means to an end. And the example we gave here is, okay, so if I get on a bus or I get on a train and I say hi to the bus driver, yes, the bus driver is a means to the end. I'm using that bus driver and that bus to get from point A to point B, but I should never treat them merely as a means. That means that, when I'm having a personal interaction with them, I must understand that they are a moral agent, and I don't be rude to them. I don't, whatever it may be. I don't just pay them the money and tell them to flip off or whatever. Like I could do that, but that's not ethical behavior, right? So those are the two principles of the categorical imperative and, you know, utilitarianism. Categorical imperative, I've mentioned Kant, who's really the philosopher most associated with that. Utilitarianism, Bentham and John Stuart Mill are the philosophers most associated with that. Yeah, I'm basically giving what anyone will learn in like the first few days of a moral philosophy course, which is totally fine. The question then becomes, how does all of this apply to animals? And I would tell you that it doesn't. How do I know it doesn't? Because again, animals, non-human animals, are part of these ecosystems. They actually rely on the ecosystem for survival. So the example we give is the example of the North American bison herd, which it seems was made extinct as part of a campaign of genocide against Native American people. That's a whole different story. But the technique that seems to have been the most effective in destroying the bison herd was not killing bison. It was destroying the wolves. Once the wolf herd was completely gone, this is what it seems according to some literature. Once the wolf herd no longer existed, the bison overgrazed certain spots. They didn't migrate along with the seasons as they used to, and they died out. They went extinct. They starved to death. Right. That's what seems to have happened. It's not a good way for them to go, but It shows the interaction between predator and prey, right? So for an individual bison, it's obviously not a good thing to be eaten by a wolf. We can agree for that. We can agree on that, right? No one wants to be eaten by a wolf. But for the entire bison herd, without the wolves preying on them from time to time, the entire bison herd died. So for the entire bison herd, the wolf was actually a very good, right? And you can see this. There's a great video. I think it's called "The Wolves of Yellowstone" or something like this that illustrates it not with bison but with deer and other things. That when you actually have some predators in there, you can have a healthy ecosystem. Without the predators, you don't have an healthy ecosystem. Okay, so in that context, non-human animals don't deal with buses, right? They deal with natural systems, which are ecosystems, and so therefore, what I would suggest is that actually what we need to be focused on are the kind of decisions, the kind of food systems that would maintain and expand those ecosystems, right? Now, again, this is stuff that I've learned after a long time of working with farmers and so on. Uh, the other thing I'll add to this is it's not just about non-human animals; it's also about humans. Like, how are we going to grow food for people when we only have so many crop cycles left, according to we're in a topsoil crisis. So, given that we're losing topsoil again because of these wasteful systems, we're not using grasslands to maintain the earth. Climate change is happening, and soil erosion is being sped up, et cetera, et cetera. And the way that you can combat soil erosion is by having those grasslands with those deep root systems, right? So, in other words, what I'm suggesting is if we begin to see an ecosystem based approach to our food, we answer questions of human survival, human starvation, but also we do what's best for the animals, right? Because these animals, um, I think they have I don't think animals have rights, but I think ecosystems have rights. I think animals have the right to sort of be part of an ecosystem. And maybe this is a good time to also introduce chickens into this discussion, right? Because um, if you have ever spent time around cows or any kind of ruminants, you will know that they tend to attract pests, right? Fly larvae and all kinds of ticks and stuff like this. And so that's where you can use birds in the wild. Here in South Africa, we have a bird called the oxpecker, which will go in and sort of eat the ticks and so on. You can use domesticated chickens to do a similar kind of role. You can use them to sort of keep. The problem with the ticks also is that they can infect humans. You can get all kinds of diseases passed by ticks, et cetera, et cetera. So you can keep the pest population down by using birds in a certain way. And when we approach the puzzle this way, like what elements, if you have an ecosystem that isn't working, like what's an example? Yeah, I don't know. We have a peach tree that really wasn't doing well. And then when we looked at it, it kind of died. When we looked at it, on the bottom was all fungus and all kinds of stuff, right? So if you have a peach tree that isn't doing well, thinking about, okay, what can I introduce to the soil? What can I introduce to the ecosystem that would actually, what is there a particular species I could have done soil of the fungus that was there, and found out, what specific fungus was eating my plant, my tree, and then I'd say, okay, well, what eats that? What can we introduce to the ecosystem that will attack this fungus? I don't know the answer. This is a research project. Attack that fungus such that the tree will again thrive. Now, the other problem, of course, is that peaches aren't native to my ecosystem here in Southern Africa. At least I don't think they are. So it's kind of a foreign plant, and here in Johannesburg, they're all foreign plants. But these are the kind of issues that we have to sort of think through and really engage with. And this question about treating the ethics of ecosystems as if it were the same as the ethics with an individual, I think is a big mistake, and I don't think it's ethical at all, because you will end up in situations where what's good for a single animal is actually bad for the whole herd. And you will destroy herds, you will destroy millions of lives, trillions of lives in the case of if we're using shovels and so on, as opposed to trying to promote life, trying to promote ecosystems and so on. Okay, so that's some food for thought. Let me know what you think. Like, were you ever tempted by the whole vegan thing? I spent years in that ideology, and it took me a long time to sort of break free of the brainwashing. I can talk more about it in the comments if people are interested. If you have any specific questions, let me know. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next one.